Welcome to Undercurrents of Romance, the show that celebrates every subgenre of romantic fiction. In each episode, I peel back the layers of your favorite love stories and chat with the talented authors who bring them to life. I'm your host, Tracey Devlyn. Now, let's dive in with today's guest. Hello, romantics. I'm here with USA Today bestseller Elizabeth Everett to talk about her new historical romance, The Lady Sparks a Flame. Welcome to the show, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. Such a beautiful cover for a beautiful book. This cover, it's so unique to me. It reminds me a lot of Deanna Rayburn's Veronica Speedwell books. Very
Yes, I love
iconic.
that. Yeah. I think actually we share a cover designer, if I'm not
Nice.
mistaken.
Yeah.
And if you look at any of my covers for either this series or the series before, The Secret Scientists of London, they're beautiful and whimsical and thoughtful. And I'm supremely grateful for them because I think they do a great job too of conveying that there's a little bit of humor in there as well.
Yes, yes, yes. And they just, it's nice that they stand out in the crowd too, just very different, very unique, but very historical. And yeah, I love the cover. I love it a lot. So I have to ask you, at what age did you admire your first rule breaker? And who was this person who set the course of your writing career?
So I live in Rochester, New York, which is the resting place, the home and the resting place of Susan B. Anthony and Frederick Douglass. And growing up, they were two figures that loomed large in my education because it was so easy to go and visit their grave sites. And the Susan B. Anthony house is here. And there are quite a few in our public schools, there are quite a few contests and days set apart for the reverence of Frederick Douglass. So these two, and I actually grew up right near where the North Star was printed, which was one of the major abolitionist newspapers. So I think most people growing up in Rochester who have a sense of the history here have those two figures in the back of their minds. They're sort of
Yeah.
like our Roman Empire, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, nice. That's such a great I guess introduction to this whole uh area or era of history, and just to have that at your fingertips and be able to go and visit it at any time you wanted to, I could see why that would make a huge impact there. That's great. Well, speaking of breakers, let's talk about Lady Phoebe Hunt. She's such an amazing character. She's, of course, returning from exile to settle her father's estate, and she plans to go back to America after it's all done. There's one line, and I wrote it down so I wouldn't forget it, that just, she stole my heart after I read this line, and it says, I have no friends anymore, only cherished enemies. And I thought that for her in this particular moment, that summed her up so, so well. And maybe you already touched on it in our little icebreaker there, but where did the inspiration for this? She's just such a deliciously complex character. Where did the inspiration come from?
Um, the inspiration for Phoebe, I would say that all of the women I write are a little bit me and a little bit the women that I surround myself with. Um, and Phoebe is an is angry
Mhm.
because of injustices. And I think that right now, especially
Mm.
myself and the women around me are very angry at injustice. So she's a reflection of, as are all my women characters, a reflection of
Mm.
all of us, really. Um, she has been damaged, and in when her first iteration, when we first meet her, it's in the first book of my first series. She acts out her anger in a way that's um, harmful not only to other people but to herself because so many of
Mhm.
us are programmed to do that. Um, And her redemption comes in this book because she's recognized that she needs to break a cycle, that cycle of self harm and of putting harm onto others,
Hmm.
when it's fueled by anger.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's I had not read the book that she was previously in, and so I was able to, at first I wasn't quite sure why she was so angry, why she was kind of attacking, in her way, some of the other characters. And I thought that you did an amazing job just piecemealing her backstory into this story so that we could understand where all of that anger and rage and everything comes from for her and just
thanks.
understand it better. I thought that
I
was
think
great.
um, this is true for all of us because we don't know what's happening with other people. So, um, right now we're encountering each other. Not you and I, Trace, but I mean,
Yes.
in general, we're encountering each other in these public spaces, and there's so much anger, and we have no idea where it comes from, and we
Hmm.
just react to that and don't give each other the grace um, to recognize there's a backstory.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I felt that very deeply with Phoebe. She's one of those women who people will say is bristly, is harsh, is cold, is overbearing, is this or that. A lot of those adjectives that people use for women
Hmm.
who speak out and speak up. And slowly, I show readers where it comes from in the hopes that when we have conversations and we're with people who are angry or strident or upset, then we can stop and remember there's a backstory.
Yeah. Well, what else would you like? I want to be very careful with spoilers, so I want to leave this up to you as far as what else would you like to tell us about this book?
This book is first and foremost a romance, and I loved writing this romance between uh, and she's an older woman, he's a younger man, and she's like, as we talked about, she's very angry and has a lot of hurt and pain in her past, and he does not. And the coming together of those two is just the most joyful part of writing this book was the two of them coming together.
Yeah.
And for anyone who enjoys a sort of, I think it's kind of like a grumpy sunshine pairing. This is
Yeah.
this is the ultimate grumpy sunshine, and
Yeah.
it's just, so there's some heavy stuff in there, but there's also so much, lighthearted, just enjoyment of a burgeoning romance.
Hmm. Yeah, it's very balanced. I thought you did a great job with balancing that because that can sometimes be difficult when you are dealing with these um, more weighty subjects. I guess I'll just use that term. So I thought you did a wonderful job having the fun and the more serious topics in there. So, do you recall what originally sparked the idea for this particular story?
Um, these characters just live in my head, even
Mm.
when I stop writing about them. So they did their own thing. I didn't. I've tried to force them into other pairings. I've tried to force them into other stories, and I've said to myself, "Oh, I should write this kind of a book, and I'll use these characters," and the characters will just be like,
Do you think you're in charge?
right? They don't, and it's and unless you're an author or maybe a really devoted reader, it's a little scary. Um, you don't, you hear someone say, "Oh, these people run around my head all day long," and you think, but
Yeah.
they do. So I feel like Sam kind of made this decision for me rather than me making
Yeah.
the decision for them.
Yeah. I love Sam. He was great. Um, You are known for writing about female characters in STEM fields. And first, let's just start with the basics for folks who might not be familiar with that term yet, STEM. Tell our listeners and viewers what STEM stands for, and then let us know what drew you to this kind of niche area of historical romance or
So
romance in general.
yes, STEM's an
Yeah.
acronym for science, technology, engineering, and math. And women have been historically unrepresented in those fields, but they've also been working in these fields for just as long as men have, but they have not been um, celebrated. They've, in fact, there's so many instances of their work being co-opted by men, or the accolades going to men, that there's a term for it. It's called the Matilda effect, and it's
Mm,
based on what happened with a woman scientist. So um, I was actually inspired by not necessarily by women in STEM. It was more science in general. This was way back pre-pandemic, way back in the old days in 2016, 2017. And um, the whole controversy around climate change was happening.
mhm,
And there became this public discourse full of disdain for scientists. And I had seen women go through engineering school and go through med school and go through all of these like STEM related fields, and the had to expend twice the amount of energy,
mhm.
and had been given half the amount of grace that their
Yeah.
male counterparts had. And I thought, okay, well, let's who's getting the brunt of dismissal and denigration right now? It's scientists. So let me write about women scientists. And then I discovered, I could write about I could write about women scientists until I stop writing, because they're so
Mm,
inspirational. There were so many of them that were just dismissed and overlooked. And there's so much we don't know about the history of women in science, and the the instances when women today, women engineers, women chemists, women astrophysicists have come up to me and said, I have to deal with male colleagues on a day-to-day basis.
mm.
What you're writing about, it's just as relevant now as it was then. That's why I continue to write about it.
Yeah. What a shame, right?
Yeah.
What a shame that we have not yet evolved as we should have. Well, one of the things that I like to dive into on this show is finding the story's undercurrent with the author. It's that second beating heart of the story that flows beneath the lover's journey. What is the undercurrent that's flowing beneath Phoebe and Sam's story, do you think?
It I think it's about a lot of times when we read about romantic love or hear quotes about romantic love, it's very much about seeing yourself in someone else. And it means removing that mask or that wall that you have between yourself and the rest of the world. When, that connection that people talk about, the soulmates, or however it is they describe it, it's about being able to be completely honest with the other person, completely oneself, and the acceptance of the other
Mhm,
person's true self. And I think that that happens with Phoebe and Sam. Underneath, they're taking off their masks. Sam doesn't. Sam presents, even though he's very affable and open and lighthearted, some of that is a mask. And Phoebe is the first person to ever tell him that he doesn't always have to be happy and open and affable. That people will still love him even if
mhm.
he's not.
Yeah.
And so I think it's easier to see with Phoebe, um, Sam's extension to her of grace, saying, "You can be who you are, because you don't need to pretend anything. You can be as vulnerable as you need to, because I'll be here." it's easy to see that, but it's not maybe as easy to see right away that Sam needs the same reassurance.
Mhm. Yeah.
So, and I write a lot about that's a secondary theme, I think, in a lot of my books,
Mm,
because it gets to the subject of vulnerability and why romance is so important. Because it takes a great deal of courage to open yourself to love. And we don't validate or value that kind of courage in our society. We think
mhm,
when we think brave, we think tough or we think
mm,
vulnerable. But in fact, I think as we all know, it can be the opposite too.
mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. So you had touched on the grumpy sunshine trope a little earlier. Can you think of any other tropes that readers could look forward to while reading The Lady and I'm sorry, The Lady Sparks a Flame?
So we have this whole idea of second chances because, when you're first introduced to her in the beginning of this book, and then in the first book in the series, Phoebe is a villain, S,
Yeah.
of majestic proportions. So there's a sort of redemption. I mean, people love one of the reason I love like Elizabeth Hoyt is
Yeah.
she does amazing like heroes who are morally gray, who are just
Yeah.
real jerks, and then they get blindsided by love.
Yeah.
And it's what happens to Phoebe in this one is she's so she's a villainess, but then all of a sudden love comes and turns her into a completely goofy person. And I think there's the she's not so much older than Sam, but she's about I think 7 or 8 years older than him. So there's an older woman, younger man sort of dynamic going on there, and it really worked for me, at least. It really worked
Yeah.
with their personalities.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but let's see what else. I'm so bad at tropes.
Yeah. They're tough to come up with off the top of your head.
They
Yeah. I suppose enemies to lovers would work and opposites attract, that sort
Opposites
of thing.
attract, I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
is definitely, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Because that's where I had the most fun writing it was when
Yeah.
their opposite personalities clashed.
Okay. You had mentioned Elizabeth Hoyt. I was wondering if there was anything recently that you've read as far as a romance that you would recommend and maybe why?
I have so many. I know, and I know I'm going to forget to mention them, and then I always do this, and then 5 minutes later, I'm like, oh,
Yeah,
um,
just tell them that I made you come up with just
okay.
one for the show, just,
All right.
yeah, blame it
So,
on me.
I'm going to give you two. So the first is Liana de la Rosa is is a has a series, the Luna Sisters series, and her third book is coming out, Gabriella and the Duke. That series is fantastic. I look up to Liana. I think she's an amazing writer, and she's also someone who introduces history that about of women's history that you're not going to be familiar with.
Mm,
Her characters actually are Mexican, and they travel to London, and then they travel back to Mexico. It's during a tumultuous time in Mexican history, and
mm.
also her intimate scenes are so good. They move the plot, but they're steamy, but they're tender. Oh, so good. And then the other one is coming out in June, and that is Joanna Lowell's A Rare Find. And Joanna's last book, A Sure Thing, had a trans male hero, one of the few in historical romances. And he was everything. And this one, the reference, one of the characters is non-binary, which you don't find often in historical romance, but
Yeah.
because Joanna is an academic as well as an author, um, she's brilliant at showing you historically where these people would fit and why they're always there and why it's important to read their narratives. And again, the heroine and the two leads are so like the there's some very scenes in there where you get very warm and you're just like whoa, but at the same time, and this is when
Yeah.
historical romance or any kind of romance is done right, when they have scenes of intimacy on the page, the sensitivities and the emotions that come with those scenes are so beautifully expressed
Hmm.
that it it just works on so many different levels. So I would say that Liana and Joanna are two of my favorite women writing in historical romance today.
That's great. I love whenever you can come across a book that will bring about awareness to you as a reader about a subject that maybe you didn't realize was even out there, or that it was happening in a particular era time frame. So that's thank you for those two. I will make sure that those pop up in the
Right.
video as I do the production of it. So
Because that's kind of the home, and that's one of the reasons that I continually advocate for historical romance to be the promotion of historical romance, because that's what happens every time, really.
yeah.
For most people, when they pick up a historical romance, if it's been researched well, or if it's done well, is you come away not just with an understanding of history, but also um, you, you're better able to see your what's happening contemporaneously
Hmm.
through a more complex filter.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Speaking of research, do you have like favorite go-to resources that you use whenever you're working on a draft?
I have reference books. The reference books I usually go back to are uh, costume like clothing
Mm,
related reference books, because the depending on if I'm writing in something set in 1842, it's going to be different than something set in 1856. If I'm writing about
yeah.
something set in London, it's going to be different than something set in America. Um, I would say for the specific works of these women scientists that are based on the um,
Hmm.
actual historical figures, I really appreciate university archives. I found, I mean, you can just do a Google search, right? And
Yeah.
websites come up, and there's always a Wikipedia. But
Yeah.
what I really
Yeah.
appreciate is that a lot of universities in their departments have been getting better and better about recording the history of women in these departments. And
Hmm.
so when I was researching Sophia Germain, when I was researching for my chemist, um, when I was researching actually Lady Sparks of Flame, the Phoebe is studying electrolysis, which is not the hair removal, it's the study of electrical waves, like electrical
Mm.
currents. Her hero is Michael Faraday, but he learned an appreciation of science and became a scientist because he picked up a textbook that was written by Jane Marcet for young women. It was a textbook to teach chemistry to women in young girls in 1801, or it was, I think it was early then. So
Mm.
and I found out about that from an academic paper that I found in an academic archives about women in science. So
Nice. Oh,
yeah,
little
no,
gems.
that was for me, like that was
Yeah.
every time I do one of these books, like something I come away with something that's just like, why this is amazing. We should all
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. It sounds like these academic resources that you're using, these are available to the public now, or are they
are. They're
behind a
available to,
paywall?
yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right,
And you'll
great.
find, I would say that a lot of times if you're interested in something, go past that first page in Google, right? Or
Yeah.
Safari, whatever you're doing, go past the first thing. And there's JSTOR, which is
Hmm.
if you're interested in anything that has to do with historical,
Yeah.
with the law, there's all these or if you're interested in science, there's um hi brain. There's um, there's a medical there's archived all the medical research papers that universities put out. They're archived
Okay.
medpub,
Okay.
and so they're out there. Just go past your
Yeah.
usual suspects, and you're gonna
Okay.
be overwhelmed with how much amazing information is out there for free.
All right, great. Thank you. Well, before we go, can you give us a hint of what's up next? Any exciting projects you can talk about?
Well, um, there as of right now, there's not going to be a third book in this series. As you might know, historical romance is, we're in a quiet phase
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
for, I think, myriad reasons, which I encourage readers to explore. Um, but I am writing, I'm working right now, actually, in the second book in a series for Berkeley. It's a paranormal rom-com,
All right.
paranormal contemporary rom-com. I always pitch it as Friends meets Buffy.
Okay. That's great.
And if you enjoy my moronic third grade humor, my pratfalls, and all the super stuff, it'll be there in spades. But also, it's the first time I've ever written contemporary,
Yeah,
and much like the reason I choose to write historical, I'm writing a paranormal contemporary because I can play with the subjects,
yeah.
um, in a way that gives you kind of a buffer. It's
Hmm.
so I can talk about contemporary issues without having it be preachy,
Hmm.
you know. And
Yeah,
then there's always a romance, and I'm a huge fan of romance. So
yeah, absolutely. Great. All right. Well, folks, when this episode airs, The Lady Sparks a Flame will be out, so be sure to order your copy. You can check out Elizabeth's website at elizabetheverittauthor.com. Do I have that right? elizabetheverittauthor.com.
mouthful.
It is a mouthful. It's just fine, but when you go to read it, it gets a little
No, it
tingly
needs a
there.
diphthong in there
Yeah.
somewhere to break it up.
Uh, Elizabeth, what other social media outlets are you most active on?
I am most active on Instagram at, or I'm going to do it too, at Elizabeth Everett Author.
There you go.
And sometimes I'm on Threads, Elizabeth Everett Author. Sometimes I'm on the Facebook, Elizabeth Everett Author books.
Okay.
So,
All right. So
um,
very consistent there. That's
yeah.
great. All right. Well, Elizabeth, thank you so much for joining me. I really love this book, and it was so great chatting with you about it.
Tracey, thank you so much for your thoughtful reading of the book and your questions. I really, really appreciate it.
Oh gosh, yeah, no, my pleasure. It was just a ton of fun to read, and I loved all the different themes that you had in there too. So thank you. Many thanks to everyone listening. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Undercurrents of Romance. You can find more information about the show at tracydevlyn.com/podcast. Undercurrents of Romance is a proud member of the Authors on the Air Global Radio Network. I'll be back soon with another great romantic read. Enjoy the adventure, everyone.